everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do a video that is, I don't know, a little bit different. It's the start of a little project that I am wanting to work on this year, which is basically, maybe not by the end of the year, but sometime soon, in the next year or two, I would really like to do a video where I talk about my favourite books of all time. The main reason for not doing that is because I feel like a lot of the books that I would initially want to put on that list are things that I've not read for quite a while. I don't know how far my tastes have changed, whether or not those books will still hold up, and so a little project that I want to have on the back burner is going back and rereading some of my old favourites, so that by the time that I do come to do an all-time favourites video, I feel like I am a little bit more assured in those favourites. And as part of that little ongoing project, I thought something that might be quite fun is to look back on some of my pre-booktube favourite books of the year, at least since I started cataloguing my reading on Goodreads. You will have seen favourites videos from me from 2020, 2021 and 2022, but as I say, I have been cataloguing my reading for a lot longer than that. And so this video is going to be going back through the books that I did list. I did keep a little list on OneNote of my favourites each year, because I am that sad. I have been wanting to do booktube for such a long time that I did keep favourites lists of the year, you know, with that intention of one day when I do booktube, I will have these favourites lists ready to go, and it just never happened. So we are starting out in 2014. Yes, I have been keeping these lists as long as 2014. 2014 is significant because that was the year that I made it my New Year's resolution to get back into reading. My reading had taken quite a nosedive during my GCSE and A-level years, and then I was at university and feeling once again like I was going to go through another like massive reading slump. I was not going to want to read outside of my course, and that made me feel terrible because, you know, prior to my GCSEs I loved to read. I would read all the time and I wanted to get back to that, but whenever I finished school I would just feel so frazzled that I just didn't have the energy to, or I would feel guilty for reading when I could be doing homework and studying. But in 2014 I decided, no, not having that, I'm going to get back into reading, and I made it my resolution to read 30 books, and I actually way surpassed that. I ended up reading 79 books in 2014, so not bad going considering that I'd read 11 the previous year. And so yeah, I'm just going to go through the 10 books that I decided would be my favourites of the year and just have a little reflect. And would I have these books quite so high now? Do I have the same regard for them 9 years later? So the book that is in the number 10 spot is The Rosie Project by Graeme Simsion. This was an ongoing series. I believe that I first heard about this via Chinzia. I think at the time her channel name was Chauncey Boddington. I haven't read this since 2014 actually, but it's a little bit of like a rom-com-y kind of book. It's this man who has this very science-based mind, very particular. He's been single all of his life and he decides that he must remedy this, but he doesn't want to just pick anybody. He wants to pick his perfect person. And so he has this entire criteria that he decides that he's going to assess a woman by to determine whether or not they are his perfect mate. And of course, through the course of the book, he ends up meeting a woman who is completely antithetical to all of these checklists and finding out that love is not so perfect. I find it interesting that this one was on my 2014 favourites because this actually didn't leave much of an impact on me. And I don't know if part of it is hindsight and knowing that I read the follow-up books to the series. I think this was a trilogy and I didn't actually like it. I didn't really like the direction that the series went. I feel like in the past few years I have read more romancy kind of books that I like a lot more, so I'm sorry Rosie Project, but you would not get on my favourites now. 9th place went to The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, another one that I haven't reread since, but I do have a very firm regard for this book. I think I read all 3 of Khaled Hosseini's published works in 2014 and this one was definitely my favourite. It was also the first one that I read, but I do think they are all really good. I think Khaled Hosseini is like master of a story, particularly master of a plot twist, like pulling the rug out from under you 20 pages from the end of a book. You think you know how a story's going to wrap up and then suddenly he just drops a bombshell on you. So yeah, even though I haven't gone back and reread this, I don't know if it would be a favourite of all time, but definitely I think it deserves its spot on this list. And has Khaled Hosseini written another novel since 2014? I'm not quite sure he has. Spot number 8 went to The Diviners by Libba Bray. In 2014, I was really definitely like testing out my reading taste. I was reading basically anything that was recommended to me by BookTube, and especially in 2014, it was definitely a lot of YA, which I just don't read a whole lot of now, but definitely did constitute a lot of my 2014 reading. This kind of meets some of my buzzwords in that it is historical. It's set in the 1920s, but it's also quite fantastical. I remember really enjoying the atmosphere and finding it very creepy, and I was on the edge of my seat whilst I was reading this, but I honestly don't remember the plot much outside of that. I do remember though, the first book had this beautiful, beautiful hardback, which I did order from America because I just wanted that stunning cover design. And then they ended up changing the cover design in later books. I think that was the main reason that I never went back to this series, which is very petty, but it is the truth. So The Diviners, whilst it's a book that I have kept on my bookshelves, I don't think it would be a favourite of all time. Following on from that, we also have 2 Rainbow Rowell books that I read in 2014, and in joint 7th spot we have Fangirl and Eleanor and Park. These 2 books were absolutely everywhere. In fact, Rainbow Rowell was absolutely everywhere in 2014. So of course I ended up reading some of her work. And in terms of my 2014-year-old self, with hindsight, I feel like I would have kept Fangirl on that list because I definitely really loved Fangirl when I read it. Eleanor and Park, I don't know why I had it on this list. I honestly don't think it's anything special, and in fact I did actually end up unhauling it in my big 2023 purge of books, but I have held on to Fangirl. I think it's the only Rainbow Rowell book that I've kept because I remember feeling like it was very synonymous with my own university experience. This very introverted girl who just like hauls away in her room and not really knowing what to do at university, how to socialise with people. That felt very on the nose and very much like me. So I feel like in terms of sentimentality's sake, Fangirl definitely deserves its spot, but would it be a favourite book of all time? Probably not. Spot number 6 goes to Stop What You're Doing and Read This. This is an essay collection on the importance of reading, which is written by multiple authors. This is one of my very first book about books, and as you might be able to tell if you know my reading taste, this is absolutely right up my street and just spawned my love for books about books. And this essay collection is just one that I don't hear people talking a lot about. I don't know if it's out of print or something, but I do always want to recommend it whenever this topic comes up. I remember it just having this very profound impact on me and just kind of like spurring me on to keep on reading, to value libraries and bookshops. And so I think when it comes to non-fiction, this would definitely get a spot in some of my all-time favourites. It's definitely one that I should reread, I think, because I haven't read it since 2014. Then spot number 5 goes to Jane Eyre. You'll see in the top 5 a few classics in here because 2014, as well as wanting to read a lot of the hyped YA that everybody was talking about, I also wanted to go back and read some of the books that I felt that I should have read by now. And of course Jane Eyre had to be on that list. And I think Jane Eyre definitely deserves its place on this list. I am very biased because I am a West Yorkshire girl, but I do love the Bronte sisters. And I think Jane Eyre is probably my favourite of the Bronte books. Very much tied up with Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And I'm definitely due a reread of the Brontes. But I just love this story. Even with all of its problematic areas, this book just pulls out so much emotion in me. I remember very distinctly when I read this. I was at a family friend's birthday party. Me, my mum, my dad, my sister had been invited, but we were the only people that we knew at that party. So we were just kind of sat in a booth in the corner, just like, who are these people? I don't know what to do. And so I did what any normal person would do in that situation. I found a PDF of Jane Eyre on my phone and decided, well, now is as good a time as any to read this. And I ended up reading about 100 pages during this party. And I was just so immersed in this story that even though very loud music was going on and dancing and celebrating, I was just so hooked on this book. And it just makes me happy. This book just makes me happy. Then another classic on this list is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is one that I actually have reread since and I definitely think holds up. I wonder how this would hold up next to some of my other favourite books of all time, but I do feel like every time I read it, I get something new out of it. That does typically happen for me with Orwell. I actually remember being in London, me and my mum had gone shopping in London, and I was just like gushing about this book and telling her about all the parallels to the Russian Revolution and telling her how clever it was, and I just loved the analogy in there. I think I was just really poised to like this at the time of life that I was reading it, having started my history degree, myself getting a bit more politically aware. And so yeah, I think this does hold up. Spot number 3 on this list went to Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler. And while I do think that this holds up in terms of like my favourite YA reads, it's one that I've kept, it's one that I do still very much treasure. I think the reason that it came up so high on this list was because more of the situation of me reading it, which is that I came home one weekend, my mum picked me up from the train station, we went home, and then very soon after that afternoon there was a power cut, and so the only thing that me and my mum could do together was just sit next to a window and read. This was a book that I'd started reading on the train and I actually finished it that afternoon, and I just have very fond memories of that afternoon of reading. It is beautifully illustrated. I feel like I was at the right time of life to have read this, but I don't know if as an adult I would have quite as much patience for it. This is one I don't think I will go back to assess for my favourite books of all time, but it's definitely one that I'm going to keep on my shelves and that I'm glad I've read. Spot number 2 on this list goes to Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, another classic that I was reading because I just felt like I should have read this by now. And I remember when I was reading this, so many people walked past my dorm room and were like, that's a good book, you should read that. This one's an interesting one because I do have very fond memories of reading this one, but I feel like a lot of my thoughts about the book were kind of tainted following the sequel, Go Set a Watchman. And it's weird because I never actually read the sequel, but but I heard so many bad things about it, and I've read a lot of criticism about To Kill a Mockingbird in the intervening years since I read it, that it had kind of made me a little bit reluctant to pick it up again. Though actually, recently I went to see the new play, the play written by Aaron Sorkin, and I thought the play was just such a brilliant adaptation of this book, grappling with a lot of criticisms that have been levelled at To Kill a Mockingbird while keeping the original story intact, and still feeling like it is very true to the original book, but also giving more voice to the black characters. Particularly Calpurnia and Tom Robinson get a lot more voice, a lot more chance to speak their minds than they did in the book. So it is still a story that I like to come back to, and I do think it's one that I want to reread as part of this favourites project. And then finally, book number 1 on this list was The Book Thief by Markus Suzak. This was actually the first novel that I finished in 2014, and it cast a very large shadow. And not just because death is the narrator, but this book hit upon so many of my now buzzwords. It is a book that is about books. It is a book that is about death, the personification of death, the importance of reading. It's a book that is set in Nazi Germany, which was a time period that, especially when I was like 17, 18, 19, I loved reading about. I was so fascinated by this worldview and how it is that ordinary people could be sucked into this and the devastating consequences of this regime. I actually remember during my GCSE years when we were learning about Nazi Germany, I would just sit in the car with my textbook and I would read aloud whole chunks of this book to my mum, and I would just be like irate about it. Just like, can you believe that people allowed this to happen? And so I feel like this book definitely hit me at the right time. I have reread it in 2020 and it does definitely hold up. But once again, I feel like it's one that I need to read again with the comparison to other things that I have loved just as much. Would this book make it to an all-time favourite? I'm hopeful that it would, but who knows, who knows? Like I say, I reread it with Shah in 2020 and it did manage to get some tears out of me. So that does bode well for it. But The Book Thief is going to be competing with so many other books. So we'll have to see what happens. I really love it. It's one that I recommend to everybody. I think it is a really beautiful story. And it is one of those books where when people say they don't like it, I get really overly defensive about it. That might be quite a sign that it is one of my favourites of all time. So there we go. Those were the top 10 books that I read in 2014, with my thoughts about it with a bit of hindsight, with a bit more knowledge about my taste now, and kind of reflection on what these books have meant to me since. And I do actually quite like looking back on these books. I'm going to try and do a video for each year. So we're going to do 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 and 2019, because those are all of the years that I was not on BookTube, but I was recording my favourite books. And so yeah, stay tuned for the 2015 instalment. Do let me know if you've read any of the books on this list, what your thoughts were about them. Would they qualify as favourite books of all time for you? Or maybe some of your worst books of all time. Whew, interesting. I didn't actually keep a list of worst books from these years. Maybe I should have. Any thoughts you have on these books, I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.